you should already have in your textbook or in your notebook a list of groups that will be on the test. Pause this and find that page in your notebook. I'm going to begin by focusing on the groups down here. Actually, a little bit of an overlap. I'll talk about zealots again at the end. But if you recall the slide presentation that I did for Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, I talked about Judaism in the time of Jesus having different denominations. That's not really the correct term, but there were different groups of Jews in the time of Jesus who had very different views about what it meant to be a Jew. Sadducees and Pharisees were in conflict with each other. The Zealots and the Sadducees and the Pharisees had very different outlooks about what it meant to be Jewish. The Essenes kind of went their own way. But very distinct types of Judaism, and you need to understand the history of Israel to understand where these groups came from. So in pre-exilic Judaism, and this is a repeat briefly of some material, I think, in Flip 17, pre-exilic Judaism was focused on the temple. That was where people offered holocausts. That's where the Levitical priesthood was centered, and they were the primary religious leaders before the Jews went into exile in Babylon. And then in exile, with the temple destroyed and living in a foreign land, Judaism had to shift. And so instead of ritual holocausts, the Torah, the kosher laws, the purity laws, the Sabbath laws became much more important. The gathering place that became important for Jews in the exile was the synagogue, not a place of holocausts. And the primary religious educators were scribes. And in the ancient world, scribes were educated people who could read and write, and typically were educated to perform functions in the royal court or in business. But in Judaism, the scribes also were the people who could read the Torah, interpret the Torah, and explain the Torah to others. And the term scribes is a little bit related to the Hebrew term rabbi, which means teacher. We'll talk about this more later. You didn't have to be educated to be considered a rabbi or a teacher in the Jewish tradition. So when the Jews returned from exile, the question is kind of left open. Is it going to revert to what it was before the exile? Are we going to go back to focusing on temple worship and Holocaust and the Levitical priesthood? Or is this new type of Judaism going to take precedence? I might be a little bit ahead of you, depending on when you are watching this. But when the Jews come back from exile, there are two important leaders who help them rebuild their society and culture. They're Nehemiah the governor and Ezra, who is described as a priest scribe. So Ezra comes back from exile. He is from a Levitical family. He is a priest. He has been trained in how to offer holocausts, although obviously in exile one cannot do that. And he's also somebody who's an educated person who studied the Torah and who interprets the Torah and teaches the Torah to others. And Ezra seems to be bridging both of these worlds. He seems to be somebody comfortable with the old style of Judaism before the exile, and also somebody who has embraced this new vision of Judaism that's emerged. And Ezra lives about 500 years before Jesus. If we place the birth of Jesus at 1 AD, then Ezra is 5 centuries before that. Brace yourself. This is as close as I get to having an animated slide on these PowerPoints. What happens between the time of Ezra and the time of Jesus is that these two visions of Judaism, the pre-exilic Holocaust-oriented Judaism and the post-exilic or the Torah-focused Judaism, begin to drift further and further apart until we get to the time of Jesus, and there are two different factions within Judaism religiously. There are the Sadducees, who believe that the temple is the most important place of worship. They believe that Holocaust is the primary way of worshiping, and that the Levitical priesthood is the center of Judaism. In contrast, the Pharisees are more progressive, if you will, that the temple isn't quite as important, that the Torah is very important, that being descended from a priestly family or knowing how to holocaust an animal is not as important as being able to understand and interpret the Torah. And the Sadducees and Pharisees actually are the two main religious leadership groups during the time of Jesus, and they're in conflict with each other. The Pharisees embrace new theological ideas, the idea of life after death. The Sadducees believe that in the old style, well, if you're good, God will make you rich, and God will reward you in this life. And the Pharisees are much more eschatological, looking forward to the end of time. Not coincidentally, the Sadducees are actually wealthy. They come from the people who control the temple, who get a portion of all the holocausts that are offered and the donations. So they're from the upper classes, and this idea that God rewards people by making them rich kind of goes along well with that. And the Pharisees are more of a middle class and much more popular with the common people, because they embrace the idea that you might not be rich in this life, but God will reward you at the end of time. Or there might be people who are living in luxury today who are going to see some sort of judgment at the end of time. So if you can think about the Sadducees and Pharisees in the context of the changes that Judaism goes through during the exile, I think that will help you. During the time of Hellenization, during the Greek period, when the Jews are being forced to accept Greek religion, Greek culture, Greek language, there are several different reactions to this process of being Greekified, if I can use kind of a horrible term. Some Jews are not willing to give up their religion. They're not willing to adopt Greek customs. They won't eat the Greek food. They won't bow down to worship the Greek gods. And those people are put to death. The term martyr literally means witness. And martyrs are people who witness to their faith by their willingness to suffer or even die for their faith. So during the period of Hellenization, when the Greeks are trying to force the Jews to abandon the covenant, some Jews become martyrs, willing to lay down their life in the hope of some sort of afterlife. There are some Jews who are apostates, some Jews who find that I'm fine adopting Greek customs, I don't need to keep the kosher laws, worshiping Yahweh is not that important to me, following the covenant and the Torah and the Sabbath laws isn't important. So some Jews abandon their faith, they become apostates. And the term apostate refers to anybody who has abandoned their religious beliefs. So if you were raised Catholic and then you become a Hare Krishna, you are considered an apostate. Or if you were raised Muslim and you become a Christian, you are considered an apostate by your fellow Muslims. Again, the people that you are joining consider you to be a convert, but the term apostate refers to somebody who abandons their religious faith. So some Jews decide to stay faithful to the covenant and to die and witness to their faith through suffering. Some Jews abandon their religion and they turn to the Greek ways. They adopt the ways of the culture around them. They are apostates. And then there's another group, and you'll read some stories about this, decide that they're going to fight for their religion. The word that's used over and over in the book of Maccabees is those who were zealous for the law, those who had zeal for the law. And the word zeal actually means enthusiasm. But you'll see when we get to those stories that these people are so enthusiastic they're willing to go out and fight and kill and die. Not necessarily with the idea that they're going to die and go to heaven, but that if they want to establish a Jewish state, they have to be willing to fight, that they're not going to give up their faith, they are going to fight for it. So let me take you back to this slide and talk about these groups in their context. The Zealots believe in a political solution to the Roman Empire. They believe in rebelling against the Romans and killing the Romans and kicking them out. They're very, very focused on the here and now, this world. The Sadducees believe in the here and now. They believe in rewards and punishments in this life, but they're very religious Jews. They believe that temple worship is very important. They are also wealthy members of the society and actually want to get along with the Romans because the Romans will protect them and protect their income stream from the temple. So the Sadducees and Zealots are both very this-worldly people, but the Sadducees are much more religious, and the Zealots are secular, not religious. The Pharisees, like the Sadducees, are religious, but they're much more eschatological, much more focused on the end of time and God's judgment later. And in contrast to the Sadducees, they see the scribes as the more important religious leaders, whereas the Sadducees see the priests as much more important. There's another group that is in existence at the time of Jesus and does not make a direct appearance in the Gospels, but is kind of an undercurrent. There's a group of Jews who, scholars think, came from the priestly class and were frustrated with the corruption of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were involved politically with the Romans. There was a lot of buying and selling of the high priesthood. And the Essenes were a group of Jews who moved out into the desert to wait for the end of the world. They believed that the eschaton was coming soon, that the end of time was coming, and God was going to wreak vengeance on the Zealots, who were just political fighters, that God was going to bring judgment on the Sadducees because of their corruption. The Essenes rejected the Pharisaic approach to Judaism. So there is this interesting group of Jews living out in the desert. They built a monastery near a little river called Wadi Qumran out by the Dead Sea. And they practiced ritual washing. They would baptize themselves to purify themselves for the final battle between good and evil at the end of time. And scholars think that John the Baptist may have been an Essene, that he may have been one of these Jews waiting for the end of the time, waiting for the end of the world, writing apocalyptic writings, these visions of the end of time and the battles between the sons of light and sons of darkness. And that John the Baptist might have been an Essene who came back into society and tried to invite other people to repent and wash away their sins. So doing this ritual washing, this baptism for common people. And of course, John the Baptist is the person who baptizes Jesus, and immediately after that, Jesus begins his preaching and his message that the kingdom of God is at hand. So, like the Pharisees, the Essenes believe in the end of the world and judgment at the end of time, but the Essenes actually think that it's coming almost immediately. So, Jesus seems to have some influence that is Essenes. Jesus is coming into conflict with the Pharisees and Sadducees of his time because he criticizes the way the temple is being used as a moneymaker. He criticizes the Pharisees for being too legalistic. And there are people who want to jump on board with Jesus because they think that he might be a political leader. So in order to understand who Jesus is and his message and the way it's received, it's important to understand the way in which these different first century groups are looking at the world, looking at what it means to be Jesus, or what it means to be Jewish, and the different ways in which they are reacting with, or reacting to, or interacting with Jesus. So I will close up here. Hopefully you have some nice definitions for all those words.